The bar smelled of engine coolant and something older. Something fermented in the dark before fermentation had a proper name. The old man sat at the far end of the counter with a glass of something amber in front of him, and he did not look at anyone who came through the door. His hands, when they rested on the bar top, showed knuckles that had been broken and reknit so many times they'd given up trying to remember their original shape. His eyes were still good. They'd have to be, given everything they'd already survived. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small medal. Red enamel over bronze, its ribbon faded to a pinkish rust. He turned it once between his fingers, dropped it into the glass, and watched the amber liquid curl around it. "They who have been," he said quietly, "to no one, will never be forgotten." He drank around the medal. He'd been doing that for 68 years. The forest had no name on any German map. That was the first thing Dolokhov noticed when they crossed the tree line, the absence of it on paper. Everything the Wehrmacht touched it, labeled, catalogued, controlled. Roads received designations. Rivers were assigned strategic classifications. Even the corpses of small villages got coordinates and reference numbers. This stretch of woodland, this dark slab of spruce and frozen creek and silence, nothing. Blank space on every capture chart they'd pulled from the last 3 convoys. Just an unmarked square between the world the Germans admitted to and whatever they'd decided not to. "That's not reassuring," Arkady muttered from Dolokhov's left. He had the build of a work shed, wide and low, and designed to survive a hard winter, and he whispered with the subtlety of a man unaccustomed to needing to. "No," Dolokhov agreed. The squad moved in spread formation through the snow between the spruces, their white cloaks making them shadows among shadows. 6 men, Dolokhov, Arkady, the sniper Petrovsky, who smelled permanently of black tobacco and machine oil, young Kostya, who still had the habit of touching his collar as if checking for a rank insignia he hadn't yet earned, Fyodor, who was broad as a doorway and quiet as a surgical instrument, and Voronin, who hummed tunelessly under his breath whenever he was frightened, which lately was always. They had coordinates pulled from an intercepted SS dispatch, a description of a facility marked only as Project Lazarus, and orders that came directly from GRU and therefore could not be questioned. They did not have a map of the facility. They did not have a clear extraction route. They did not have any real intelligence about what the facility contained. What they had was themselves. And in 1945, in this particular forest, that had always been enough. Dolokhov halted them with a fist. Through the tree line ahead, exhaust plumes, flicker of headlights bouncing across snow-crusted ground. He used 2 fingers to direct Petrovsky left, and Voronin right for a wider view, then crouched and waited with the patience of a man who had learned that haste and death kept the same address. Convoy 3 vehicles, S markings. The half-track at the rear was military surplus, stripped and rebuilt with the kind of improvised brutality that meant field engineers, not factory lines. Troops, dismounting from the lead truck, moved with the rigid automatic efficiency of soldiers who believed completely in something. That specific kind of belief, not fear, not ambition, but conviction, was the most dangerous variety. Dolokhov gave the signal. What followed was brief and absolute. 3 minutes from first shot to last. The Spetsnaz moved through the convoy like a mathematical proposition. If you were here, then you were finished. Dolokhov took the officer personally. 2 seconds of close work that he didn't let himself think about until later. And when it was done, the forest went quiet again, except for Voronin's tuneless humming, which had gotten slightly faster. They searched the vehicles. Fyodor found the medical files first. Thick folders of documentation in German technical language, drawings of syringe configurations, photographs of subjects in various states that none of them looked at for longer than a second. Kadi found a glass vial, still sealed, with a yellowish fluid inside and a stenciled serial number. Strange human remains in a cargo crate. The word remains barely adequate, as though the body in question had been revised, rather than killed. Its musculature thickened wrong. Its skeleton bent at angles a live person had no use for. "Is this?" Kostya said, and his voice had gone very young. "It's what we're here for," Dolokhov said. "Touch it. Leave it." Then the half-track came back. It materialized from the forest edge, with its gun already traversing, and there was nothing clever about what happened next. Only physics. The half-track's weapon finding Voronin before Voronin found cover, and then the team was scattering into the trees with the discipline of trained soldiers and the fear of ordinary men, which were not mutually exclusive. Kostya caught a round in the leg and went down hard, his cry muffled by snow. Arkady dragged him. Sokin found a tree and pressed himself against it, but the grenade found him instead. And that was the end of Osokin, who had a wife in Novosibirsk, and who made very good dumplings, and who deserved considerably better than this. Fyodor ran north. Trovsky went east, firing over his shoulder to give Dolokhov the 3 seconds needed to break cover. And then something grabbed Petrovsky from the right side of the tree line, and the screaming was brief and absolute, the kind of sound that the human throat makes only at the very end of everything. And Dolokhov ran and did not look back. He was captured 20 minutes later. They were waiting in the trees. Of course they were. The bunker smelled of rot and ammonia and electricity. Not the clean hospital kind of rot. This was something more specific, more studied. The smell of biological processes being redirected against their own best interests. The walls were poured concrete, sweating. The ceiling had that low industrial oppressiveness that architects build into spaces where they don't want the occupants to remember they're human. Dolokhov was put in a cell. Through the bars he could see another cell, Arkady in it, which meant Arkady was alive, which was the first good news he'd had since Osakin. And there was a third man, in Arkady's cell, a lean, pale face with American cheekbones and the specific well-rested look of a man who either hadn't been here long enough to stop sleeping, or was considerably more frightened than he appeared. "Rogers," the American said, extending a hand through the bars. "Oss, don't ask me to prove it." "I wasn't going to," Dolokhov said. "Smart." Rogers glanced down the corridor. "They brought you from the convoy ambush site. You took them apart pretty well out there." "Not well enough." Rogers smiled without warmth. "That's the thing about this place. No one gets here because they weren't good enough. They get here because the people who built this place found a way to make the math come out different." Dolokhov looked at the ceiling. He could hear something from below. A mechanical hum, low and persistent, beneath the natural frequency of the building. It was the kind of sound that didn't belong to any machine he recognized. The kind of sound that came from something that had been engineered not to produce a recognizable noise. Because recognizable noises gave people space for understanding, and understanding was something the people who built this bunker were very careful to prevent. Somewhere further down the corridor came a young man's scream. "Kostya." Dolokhov was on his feet and at the bars before the sound finished. The guard at the end of the hall. He was a guard only in the loosest sense. His uniform right, but his posture wrong. Something about the angle of the neck and the flatness of the eyes that suggested the uniform had been put on over something else. Something that didn't need rank insignia to define itself. Turned and looked at Dolokhov, with the incurious expression of a stone. Kadi and Dolokhov tore strips from their uniforms and bound them to improvised lengths of pipe from the cell's bunk frame. They didn't need to discuss it. When Kostya's screaming started again, the cell door's lock mechanism was already compromised by 17 years of Siberian manufacturing standards versus 2 men who had nothing left to lose. The improvised weapons were crude. The will behind them was not. They got to Kostya's cell. The thing inside it had been a German soldier once. The uniform suggested it. But the uniform was wearing the soldier rather than the other way around. Its chest moved with the wrong rhythm. Its hands, when Dolokhov's pipe connected, gave back an impact that felt less like striking bone and more like striking something that had forgotten bones were for movement and started using them only for structure. They killed it. The word is sufficient. They killed it with boots and pipe ends and the specific unceremonious competence of men who had made violence their profession, not because they liked it, but because it was the only remaining language that the situation responded to. Kostya died anyway. The wound in his leg had been the smaller problem. The larger problem was the bite. Dolokhov covered him with his own jacket. Arkady stood very still and said nothing. Rogers, watching from the corridor through the gap in the bars they'd forced open, said, "I'm sorry. It was the most human thing he'd said, and he said it quietly, and Dolokhov believed him. Standartenführer Strasser was a man designed by committee. Everything about him had been optimized for a single purpose: the projection of certainty. His cheekbones, his posture, his way of entering a room, as though the room had been waiting for him. All of it calculated. He wore his confidence the way a building wears its load-bearing walls. Not as decoration but as structure. The thing that kept everything else from collapsing. He had them brought to the laboratory. It was, Dolokhov thought, the cleanest room he'd seen in 4 years of war. Stainless surfaces, proper lighting, the smell of antiseptic so thick it sat on the tongue. There was a large cylindrical chamber at the center of the room, glass and steel, riveted at intervals, with a control panel that looked like it had been designed for something that should not exist yet. Cables ran from it to a secondary generator in the corner that produced the low hum Dolokhov had felt through the floor. Strasser explained it, the way an engineer explains a bridge. Quietly, accurately, with the specific pride of a man describing work that most people wouldn't understand, but would eventually benefit from, whether they wanted to or not. The serum in the vials activated cellular regeneration at a level that shouldn't be possible. The body's fight mechanism unshackled from its factory settings, stripped of the safety protocols that kept a human being limited to human being tolerances. The machine did the rest. A field effect, borrowed from theoretical physics that Strasser declined to name, that locked the cellular activation in place and made it permanent. "You understand what that means," Strasser said. His German was careful, deliberate. He watched Dolokhov's face the way a craftsman watches a workpiece. "It means," Dolokhov said in German that surprised Strasser slightly, "that you have built something that doesn't die." Strasser smiled. "Doesn't die easily. Everything has its terminus." He glanced at Fyodor. "We've found that subjects who enter the process with exceptional physical conditioning respond differently. Merely reanimated, enhanced, purposeful." He paused. "Colleague is quite remarkable." The test subject they brought out next was not someone Dolokhov had recognized, and he was grateful for that. The machine did its work in 40 seconds. Some of the guards in the adjacent room retched audibly. Dolokhov watched without expression, cataloging every detail. The chamber's locking mechanism, the control panel's layout, the placement of the secondary generator, the air duct grid mounted high on the east wall. He had learned, over 4 years of situations that killed other people, that the most useful thing a mind can do in the worst moments is work. Fyodor in the chamber next. Fyodor was from Omsk. He had a sister who kept bees and a habit of whittling small figures from whatever wood was available on long marches. Not carefully, not artistically, just repetitively, the way some men smoke. He had never in Dolokhov's knowledge complained about anything. Cold, hunger, fear, the specific misery of winter warfare in German territory. And when they locked the chamber door behind him, he looked at Dolokhov through the glass with an expression that was not fear but something adjacent to it. Something that said, "I know what this is going to cost, and I've already paid it. Don't worry about me." The machine fired. Fyodor did not scream. When they opened the chamber door, he was still standing. His breathing had changed. Deeper, longer, like a man who had just been given more lung, and his hands were different at the knuckles, the tendons more pronounced, as though his body had quietly restructured its architecture to better serve a purpose it had not yet been told. He killed 4 Germans in the next 6 seconds. He would have killed more, but the sedative they hit him with was pharmaceutical grade and generous. Dolokhov watched them drag Fyodor away and thought about the position of every air duct cover he'd seen since entering the facility, and the tooth he'd palmed from the floor when the first creature died, and the gap he'd calculated between the shift changes of the 2 guards posted at the lab door, and said, "Impressive." Strasser nodded. He thought the compliment was for him. The cell door gave because Dolokhov's mathematics were better than its manufacturers. The tooth from the dead creature's mouth, dense, abnormally calcified. One of the many small wrongnesses that the process produced worked in the lock mechanism with a precision that the lock's designer had not anticipated, because the lock's designer had never needed to account for men who collected murder weapons from the bodies of their dead enemies on the off chance they'd be needed. He moved through the facility's lower level in a borrowed SS uniform that fit badly, but fit well enough for the 11 seconds of corridor crossing it needed to accomplish. 3 guards. He was past them before they resolved from background to threat, which was a function of the uniform's misdirection and his own particular way of walking. Not sneaking, which telegraphs anxiety, but moving with the specific purposeful stride of someone who belongs wherever they happen to be, which is the most effective camouflage ever devised. The radio room was locked. He opened it the hard way, which was quiet enough. The radio was a standard military set, and he knew its configuration from years of pulling them apart in the field. But the frequency was scrambled, and the moment he started transmitting, he heard the counter jamming kick in. They were monitoring for unauthorized use, of course, they were. This facility had been built by people who thought of everything, which meant that Dolokhov would have to be more creative than they'd anticipated. He left the radio and went back for Fyodor. The laboratory secondary generator was the key. He'd noted it during Strasser's lecture. The machine's power requirements were enormous, which meant the generator was running near capacity, which meant that a specific kind of interference introduced to its fuel supply would produce a specific kind of cascade failure that would unlock the magnetic containment on the specimen cells on level 6, which he'd heard 2 technicians discussing in rapid German outside the lab earlier while they thought no one was listening. He did not do this yet. He filed it for later. Fyodor was in a reinforced holding room adjacent to the laboratory. The 2 guards at the door were alive in only the technical sense. Their eyes had that flat petroleum sheen that marked the ones who'd been through the process, the light behind them extinguished or redirected into something that no longer bothered with expression. Cop killed them with the surgical precision of a man who understood exactly where to apply force to produce a silent result. And he did not let himself think about whether something that looked like a person and wore a person's uniform and had once been a person required a different moral calculation, because that calculation had a time and a place. And this was not it. He got Fyodor out. Fyodor was still himself. Mostly, though his hands had developed a faint tremor that he controlled by clenching and unclenching his fists in a slow, deliberate rhythm, like a man something internally that needed to be kept below a certain number. "How do you feel?" Dolokhov asked. Fyodor considered this with genuine effort. "Like everything is very loud," he said, "and very clear and very close. Can you hold it?" Another pause. Fyodor looked at his hands, watched them shake, made them stop. For a while. That was enough. Chief surgeon died in the laboratory with the economy of effort that all of Dolokhov's kills had, by this stage in the war, acquired. The nurse, a woman who had watched 3 people put into the chamber and had not looked away once, whose clinical detachment was either courage or its complete absence. Dolokhov did not kill. He injected her with the same serum she'd prepared for others, and put her in the chamber himself and sealed the door. He was not certain this was justice. He was certain it was equivalence. Then the 2 of them went deeper. Level 6 was where Strasser kept his inventory. The cells here were industrial, not built for 1 or 2 but for dozens. The doors had external locks controlled from a central panel at the corridor's midpoint, and the corridor itself was wide enough for 4 men abreast because it had been designed for things that moved differently than men and needed the width to navigate effectively. The smell here was worse than anywhere above. That same biological wrongness, concentrated, layered, the odor of processes that had been forced to continue past the point where they naturally stopped. Fyodor moved ahead of Dolokhov, his fists still opening and closing in that slow rhythm. His footfalls had changed in character. Quieter, more deliberate. The body rerouting its energy from noise to efficiency in ways that weren't entirely voluntary. Dolokhov watched him from 3 steps back and thought about Kostia's jacket, which he'd left covering a boy who'd deserved 60 more years, and about Petrovsky who'd given him 3 seconds at the cost of all of his, and about Voronin who'd hummed tunelessly because he was frightened, and who had not deserved the half-track, and who would not be humming anymore, and he let those thoughts do what they needed to do, and then he put them in the place he'd learned to put such things. Not away, not forgotten, but filed, preserved, deferred. their weight available to him when the fight needed weight, which was now. They heard Strasser behind them on the corridor. He'd come without his uniform jacket, which meant this was personal. He'd been watching on his monitors, and had come himself rather than sending men, which meant he valued what was about to happen enough to witness it directly. He had a pistol. He also had, behind him, the brute. The hand-to-hand specialist they'd put it into Burr first, rebuilt from something like a soldier into something like a weapon, its face reconstructed by the process into an expression of permanent mechanical readiness. Strasser shot Arkady. Arkady had been in the facility for 14 hours. He had watched Kostya die. He had been beaten twice, and not broken, and had not made any sound during either event that gave them anything. He was from the Urals, which might explain some of it. He was a Soviet soldier, which explained the rest. He went down hard, and Dolokhov went to him and held the side of his face, and Arkady said, in Russian, something brief and private that is not recorded here because it belongs only to the two of them, and then he was gone. And the Red Army lost one of the best men Dolokhov had ever fought beside. Dolokhov stood up. Strasser was saying something, the specific kind of monologue that scientists deliver when they are also unfortunately true believers, a combination that produces an especially tedious variety of certainty. But Dolokhov was not listening because Fyodor had turned around and the rhythm in his fists had finally run out. What happened next was not a fight. Fights have exchange, the back and forth of matched agencies. Happened was the door of a furnace opening, a brief, total, terrifying warmth, and then the burning. Fyodor went through the brute with the specificity of a man who understood exactly where a body's structural tolerances lay, even a body that had been restructured to move those tolerances outward, because the machine's engineering was brilliant, but it was also German, which meant it was systematic, which meant it was, at its core, predictable, and Fyodor had 4 minutes left of being himself, and he spent with the completeness of a man who knows exactly what he's spending. Dolokhov dealt with the remaining guards while Fyodor occupied the brute. He dealt with them with 3 years of battlefield close quarters experience and the borrowed pipe he'd been carrying since the first cell, and when he turned back, Fyodor was kneeling on the floor of the corridor with the brute's neck broken beneath his hands, and Fyodor was shaking. And the tremor was no longer in his hands but his entire body now, and the fists couldn't help anymore. "Go," Fyodor said. His voice had changed, rougher, thicker, as though something had moved into it and was beginning to rearrange the furniture. "Go!" He looked up, and the eyes were still his, barely the way a winter sky is still blue under the weather coming in. "I'll make sure they don't follow." A pause. Tremor intensified, and he locked it down by main force of a will that had been extraordinary before the machine and was now terrifying. "Make sure." Dolokhov gripped his shoulder, said nothing. There was nothing adequate, and Fyodor had always preferred precision to sentiment anyway. He went. Level 6 opened when the generator cascade hit its critical stage. Dolokhov heard it from the elevator. The magnetic locks releasing in sequence, a sound like a building exhaling, and then the screaming from below, which was mostly German, and which served its purpose. The elevator moved up. The brute, which had survived Fyodor's attention through the sheer stubbornness of its engineering, pried the elevator doors open at top floor and slaughtered its way through the SS garrison there with terrible, indiscriminate focus of something that had been mod for violence and finally given permission to use it completely. Dolokhov let it work. He moved around it through the chaos, through the smoke from the generator room. The corridor, where Strasser was attempting to reach his personal radio equipment, and he found Strasser at the equipment, and he finished what the forest had started an eternity of 12 hours ago. He did it with his thumbs, because he was out of ammunition and out of improvised weapons, and because, in the end, it was sufficient. The eyes, through the orbital, the specific pressure required, it was not elegant. Very little that is true is. He stood over Strasser for a long moment. The man who had looked at Fyodor through the glass, with a craftsman's admiration for good raw material. The man who had built something that didn't die easily out of men who used to be men. The man who had decided, somewhere in his educated and precise and utterly empty soul, That the question of what separated a person from a process was academic. Nothing academic about it, Dolokhov said, in German, to the empty room. Then he went to find the air duct Rogers had mentioned. The surface was snow and dark, and the specific cold that comes at 300 in a European forest in March. The cold that seems to come from inside the earth, rather than down from the sky. He broke through the duct's exterior grate and rolled into a snowbank, and lay there for a moment, breathing, letting the animal part of his brain confirm that he was alive, and that alive was the correct condition to be in. He set off the tripwire by accident. He was tired. Tiredness at this level is not a character flaw but a physical fact. Like altitude, it changes what the air contains, limits the precision available, makes the world slightly smaller and slightly less predictable than it needs to be. Flare went up. Pink light over the forest. Beautiful. In the abstract, the way most things that will kill you are beautiful from the right distance. Dog unit came through the trees. 3 men and what had been their fourth, the reanimated tracker, which moved through the snow on all fours, with the disjointed efficiency of something that had been redesigned for purpose rather than dignity. The SS captain leading the unit had the special confidence of a man who believed that everyone he hunted was already dead. They just hadn't been officially informed yet. Dolokhov had a tree branch. He had specifically a section of fallen spruce approximately 1 meter 40 in length, frozen solid, weighing perhaps 4 kilograms, a tool absolutely consistent with what was available to him, which was to say, nothing sophisticated, nothing elegant, nothing that the people who built the bunker had accounted for in their threat assessments. Because the people who built the bunker thought in terms of systems, and systems have specifications, and specifications have limits, and there is no specification written for a man who has been awake for 22 hours, and who has lost 4 men in the last 12 of them, and who has run out of everything except the particular stubbornness that comes from caring more about the result than the method. He hit the reanimated soldier across the cervical vertebrae and dropped it into the snow, which did not kill it, but removed it from the immediate calculation. The captain came at him with a knife. Dolokhov turned the knife, broke the captain's wrist with the branch in the same motion, and introduced the captain to the ground with a persuasiveness that left no room for further discussion. The remaining 2 guards he took sequentially, which is the only way to take 2 guards with a tree branch, and it worked because it had to work, and because Dolokhov had learned very early in the war that the gap between has to work and will work is, in practice, thinner than it looks. Thin enough, anyway, to run through at speed. He stood in the snow with the bodies of dog unit around him and the reanimated soldiers, still moving weakly in the snowbank to his left. He looked at it for a long time. Then he picked it up. It weighed more than a living man of the same size, the process having added something to the density of the tissue, but it was manageable, and slung it over his shoulder. Proof. His orders had specified proof of the German project. He'd carried everything else out of the bunker in his head. This he'd carry out on his back. He oriented himself by stars. The German-marked sky, at least, had been left unmarked, which was the one navigation advantage the Reich had failed to optimize away, and he began to walk toward the Russian lines. He hummed, tunelessly after a while. It was not his habit. He thought about Voronin and decided the man had been onto something. The debriefing lasted 9 days. He told them everything. The serum, the machine, the field effect, the exact location of the bunker, the names of the personnel he'd identified, the technical language Strasser had used in the laboratory, every detail he'd filed away during the hours of captivity and infiltration and violence. He told them about the creature he'd carried out of the forest, which had been delivered to GRU handlers who had looked at it with the specific expression of men encountering something they would never discuss in writing. He told them about Arkady and Petrovsky and Voronin and Kostya and Fyodor. He did not tell them what Arkady said at the end. That was not intelligence. That was a different category of information entirely. They gave him a medal, red enamel over bronze. He looked at it for a while in the debrief room after everyone else had gone, turning it in his fingers the way you turn a stone that's heavier than it looks, feeling the weight of it against the weight of what it was meant to represent, and finding that the math didn't quite resolve. that there was no denomination of metal and ribbon that converted properly into the currency of what had been spent. He kept it anyway. You keep the things that don't convert, because they're the only record of what actually happened. Back at the bar, the glass was still in front of him. The metal at the bottom of it caught the light in that particular way that old bronze does. Not shining, not glittering, just present, solid, occupying its space without apology. A man came through the door, younger, better dressed, with the careful casual posture of someone who'd been briefed on who they were meeting and had decided that nonchalance was the appropriate tactical choice. He sat at the far end of the bar, ordered something he didn't drink, and then moved 2 stools closer. Teed a notebook on the bar. Battered, old, filled with handwriting Dolokhov recognized immediately. English, a specific neat technical style, diagrams and coordinates. "You know what that is," the man said. Dolokhov looked at it without touching it. "I know what that is. We're reopening the project." Silence. The bar's ambient noise moved around them. Ice in glasses, distant conversation, a door somewhere in the back. "There are teams," the man said carefully, "who are going back in, to the bunker. Understand what was built there, and how to build it again, or how to stop it from being built again. Depending on who funds the second expedition, we'd like your input, your experiences." "My experience," Dolokhov said, "cost 4 men. The man absorbed this. He had the grace, at least, not to produce a counter-argument immediately. Dolokhov picked up the metal from the bottom of the glass, held it in his palm for a moment, then he set it back down on the bar top, outside the glass this time, where the light hit it differently. No amber filter, no liquid distortion, just the object itself in ordinary light. He looked at the younger man for the first time directly. "Order something real," he said. "I'll tell you what I saw. Not what to do with it, what I saw." The younger man nodded and signaled the bartender. Dolokhov turned his glass once, set it down. The sound of it was small and final, a period at the end of a very long sentence that had started in a German forest 68 years ago, among trees with no names on any map. He began to talk. Outside, the night continued its operations. Cold, indifferent, unhurried, the way nights always are when the days they follow have been spent at maximum intensity. Stars in their positions. Forest somewhere to the east. All forests eventually becoming one forest if you walk far enough. Somewhere in that forest, beneath concrete and memory and 6 decades of accumulated silence, something was still running on its generator. Still humming its single low note, still waiting with the patience of a thing that had been engineered not to run out. The man who had walked out of it was still here too. Older. Heavier in every way that isn't measured in kilograms. Still turning a bronze medal in his fingers when no one was watching. Still here. That, in the end, was the only answer to the machine that had ever mattered. The exhausted, stubborn, irreducible fact of still being here when everything the facility had been designed to produce was finished. Not invincible, not enhanced, not reanimated or restructured or optimized. Just a man on the far side of the worst thing that had happened to him. At a bar. With a glass, with a metal that didn't convert to anything, still talking. That's what the machine couldn't account for. Not the strength, not the weapons or the tactics or the improvisational violence that 4 years of war had polished to a specific sheen. What it couldn't account for was the part of the human being that refuses to accept the facility's implicit proposition that a person is raw material, that courage is a variable, that the only thing between survival and death is the correct engineering. Dolokhov had lived the counter-argument. He was still living it. "They who have been," he said quietly, to no one in particular, while the younger man drank and waited, "will never be forgotten." He left the metal on the bar when he walked out. Let whoever found it figure out what it converted to. He'd carried it long enough.